From the darkest reaches of space to the deepest corners of your mind. Welcome to From the Void.
Welcome to Season 5 of From the Void. I'm your host, John Williamson, and I can't wait to share all of the strange and unusual mysteries we've collected for this season. The first mystery we're going to dive into this season is a crime that has gone unsolved for nearly 40 years. It involves a man named Barry Berman and his wife, Louise. Those names may not ring a bell, but most of us have probably heard of the popular liqueur Kahlua, an essential ingredient in the very delicious cocktail, the White Russian, and the preferred drink of the dude from the movie The Big Lebowski. But what does Kahlua have to do with any of this, you ask? Well, Barry happened to be the son of Jules Berman, who made a fortune through real estate and as the first person to import Kahlua, amongst other popular imported alcohols, into the United States. Very different from his famous father, Barry was a guy who loved the outdoors and was a spiritual seeker. Where this mystery begins is when Barry and his wife, Louise, who is nearly 20 years older and a fellow spiritual seeker, go on a trip to the Saline Valley Hot Springs for some rest and relaxation and an opportunity to breathe new life into their relationship. We know they made it to their campsite and met a few fellow travelers, but what occurred after has yet to be conclusively determined. Author Doug Kari's book, Berman Murders, Unraveling the Mojave Desert's Most Mysterious Unsolved Crime, is the most comprehensive look at the Berman case. Doug joins me this week for part 1 of this week's episode, The Berman Murders, the Mojave Desert's Most Mysterious Unsolved Crime, on From the Void. I have a guest I'm very excited to have on this week. I've got author Doug Kari with me. Doug, thank you so much for spending some of your day with me.
John, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. This is a fascinating book. Obviously, we were just briefly chatted about the fact that true crime is very, very popular right now, especially I think, there's so many true crime podcasts out there at the moment. The market's pretty flooded. And so there's a lot of podcasts that have covered a lot of sort of the more high profile crimes. But this is sort of a lesser known mystery that for a long time went really unsolved. So tell listeners a little bit about, how did you find out about this case and what drew you to it?
So, John, I got into it because of my love for the area where these murders occurred. If you can picture one of the most remote desert regions of the western United States, in fact, Saline Valley is extraordinarily difficult to get to. You go on a 2-lane paved road towards Death Valley, and in a place that could fairly be characterized as the middle of nowhere, you turn onto a dirt road, and from there you proceed 50 rugged miles when it's even passable. And sometimes it isn't because of rains or snow. You cross over a mountain range and then come down into this valley that's untouched by time. It's a remarkable place. Just this pristine desert wilderness with rippling sand dunes and a silvery saltwater lake. And in the middle of this timeless desert valley is a palm tree oasis where natural hot springs over the years have been developed by hippies and eccentrics and desert rats into a bathing oasis of soaking pools, stone and concrete pools where the hot water has been piped. You come into camp there, John, and it's not uncommon. The first thing you see is somebody walking with maybe a big hat and sunglasses and sandals and nothing else. It's a place where people commune with nature, and it's just a remarkable location. I had been going there for years, and when the Bermans just suddenly vanished and then later turned up dead in a grave miles away, it stunned the people like me who loved this wonderful place and thought of it as a sanctuary, not a crime scene.
Yeah, it's absolutely fascinating. I love how you describe in the book, and as you just did, this area, because you comment on the fact that it's not a huge distance away from the parts of California that come to mind for most people, sunny and beaches and stuff like this, but yet there's some extreme weather there, and that sort of comes into play at the very, very beginning before we knew it was a murder investigation. So talk a little bit about how the initial call came in, and also kind of paint the picture that this is decades ago, well before the advent of cell phones and technology like that.
It is. We're talking January 1986, and in the town of Independence, which remains this little county seat. At the time, it had a population of about 600. I don't think there's that many more folks living in Independence, California today. In fact, it may even be less. A deputy named Leon Boyer is manning the radios, and a radio call comes in from Saline Valley. There was one fellow out there, a guy named Chili Bob, lived out there in a little trailer, and he had a two-way radio, and he called in to report that there were some campers who seemed to be overdue, a man and a woman, and their truck hadn't been moved, and it was just sitting there at one of the little campsites. And so Deputy Boyer assigned the call to another deputy, a fellow who's now gone, named Larry Freshour. I wasn't able to ask him, why didn't you follow up right away? But the fact of the matter is he didn't. The call about these missing people comes in on a Friday afternoon, and he just does whatever and doesn't follow up. Come Monday, Leon Boyer calls him again and says, you got to get on this missing person call, this abandoned vehicle. And he finally heads out to Saline Valley, and it's a long drive to get in there, John. It's a tough go. That may be why Freshour delayed. Maybe he was hoping that Barry and Louise Berman would somehow reappear.
Yeah, that is an interesting part of the story. It almost feels like, and to your point earlier, this is not a place where a lot of crime historically has happened at this point. And so, your first thought is, abandoned vehicle. Probably some hikers that wandered off, they'll come back. So I'm sure that sense of urgency just wasn't there. But regardless, knowing what we know now, probably should have gotten out there a little quicker, So
right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So talk about the fact that, the mystery starts to unfold. There's that initial call, as you said, to, from this guy, this character named Chili Bob. And so when he finally gets out there and checks out the truck, what's sort of the initial thought process here?
Well, a couple of things happen, John, kind of at once. One is that Freshour gets out there to the scene, finds the abandoned vehicle, doesn't see any obvious clues of what might have happened to the owners. Meanwhile, the sheriff's office gets another call from a woman in Santa Barbara who's a friend of the couple saying, hey, these folks are overdue. They were supposed to be back days ago. Can you help us find them? And the confluence of those two events made the sheriff's office realize, wait, we may have, a problem on our hands. So they start to initiate a search, and it just mushrooms. Couple of things happen. One is that the initial searching doesn't turn up any clue of what happened to the couple, Barry and Louise Berman. The other thing that happens is it becomes clear that although they're hippie types, kind of unassuming, that actually Barry is the heir apparent to the Kahlua liqueur fortune. His father, Jules Berman, is a fabulously wealthy Southern California entrepreneur, well-connected. And here is this son of the only child of this rich father, and the father's demanding answers. So the case just starts to go from there. Next thing you know, it's like a war zone in Saline Valley. There are helicopters coming in from China Lake Naval Weapons Center, from California Highway Patrol. The Stockton National Guard sent down a big helicopter, and ground teams are arriving from all over, and they're scouring the valley by air, on foot, trying to find out what happened to this couple. How could they just vanish?
So talk about law enforcement, obviously, as they get engaged and they realize that, these folks, in fact, are missing, because we're talking more than 72 hours from the reporting of the vehicle. Once they kind of determine where they went after exiting the vehicle, what are their first impressions? Are they thinking, again, these are just two naive hikers that just went too far and got lost and are just wandering around out there in the desert? Or what are their first sort of impressions?
Well, that's the initial thought, is that they just got overextended. That's what Leon Boyer thought when I interviewed him. He thought, oh, they just, they set out on a hike and they got overly ambitious. I mean, it happens out there. It happened to me out there years earlier. Me and a buddy, one of our first trips into Saline Valley, we got overextended. We self-rescued in the sense that we found our way back out of the mountain range that we had climbed into and got back to where the car should have been. But by then our friends had gone off to get help, and the next thing you know, there's a helicopter come looking for us. But, we were found quickly. It was one of those experiences that you learn from as a young mountaineer, a young explorer. But for the Bermans, it became clear after a certain point, wait a minute. First of all, they had information that Louise Berman, who was 52 years old, 17 years older than Barry, had a sore ankle and had not planned to do much hiking. Also, they had left their cameras in the truck, and if somebody going out on a long hike, you would think they would bring at least one camera with them. So it started to look like they had just gone out on a short hike and not come back. And by now, they should have been found. I mean, when you're flying over the desert in a helicopter, a fixed-wing aircraft, and I've done both, you can see things on the ground pretty clearly, and they weren't spotted. And meanwhile, there was all these searchers out there scouring the places that you wouldn't be able to see as well from the air. So the sergeant in charge of the search, a very smart, dedicated guy named Dan Lucas, he later became sheriff of Inyo County, he starts to think, this must be foul play. But who and why?
Yeah, and what's interesting too is you dig in to like really who Barry and Louise Berman were, and you mentioned there was a bit of an age difference, and they were two very, very different people that I'd love for you to talk a little bit about, but also in sort of figuring out who they were as people. You also found out that Barry was a pretty accomplished outdoorsman, so it would seem that pretty early on, this doesn't seem like the sort of guy that would just wander off and get lost. He knew his way around.
Barry did know his way around, and he was good with his hands. He was good in the outdoors. So they did come from very different backgrounds. Louise was born 17 years earlier than Barry in what you'd call a working class environment in East Los Angeles. She had a troubled childhood. She had been molested. She didn't bond with her mother. Her mother had farmed her out to live with other people as her mother cycled through various lovers and husbands. It was a very tough home environment. Barry, on the other hand, was born into fabulous wealth, as I mentioned. His father, Jules Berman, just seemed to be a Midas when it came to entrepreneurial ventures. He had, early in his life as a young man, had built a string of 6 liquor stores starting in Beverly Hills and had made a small fortune. And then he became a liquor distributor after World War II and spotted a trend. He spotted that consumers in the U.S. might be interested in kind of exotic overseas alcoholic beverages. So he was one of the people who pioneered bringing a unique tasting beer called Heineken to the United States. And of course, that became a huge success. J&B Scotch and various other overseas alcoholic beverages. Then he had this opportunity to buy a liqueur called Kahlua that nobody had ever heard of. It was only selling fewer than 1,000 cases a year. And he was just a genius promoter who plowed money into advertising and went out and pitched. And Kahlua became this huge success worldwide, selling over 1 million cases a year. Jules Berman had a mansion in Beverly Hills. He had a yacht named Kahlua. He had a garage full of exotic cars like Maserati and Ferrari and Rolls Royce. The fellow who founded Tiger Lines, it's an early air package delivery service that later became acquired and became one of the origins of FedEx. He and that entrepreneur, they were both very successful. They owned a 10,000 acre hunting preserve together. He got involved up at Lake Arrowhead in Los Angeles, Jules did, with some partners. He didn't just like do a little dabbling in real estate. They bought the entire lake. It's a private lake. They bought 3,000 acres of surrounding woodlands. They bought the village and they developed a golf course and made it this huge thing. He went into big residential real estate development, Huntington Harbor and other places. He got into oil. I mean, he was so wealthy, but he and his wife were rather cold. You know, they had servants. They kind of farmed out raising Barry to servants. And he was a very kind of detached and thoughtful young man who really pushed back against this lifestyle that was so devoid of love and parental affection. So you have two kind of damaged people, John, who both find their way independently to a Punjabi guru named Charan Singh, and they become disciples of this guru and begin practicing transcendental meditation. And it's through that shared connection that they meet. By the time they meet, as you indicated, Barry has done a lot of exploring of hot springs and such. He's a very accomplished outdoors guy, and Louise herself had lived in the outdoors before. So these were experienced folks going into an area they hadn't been in before, but they weren't novices.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting part of the story. And so obviously before too long, they realized that they aren't just lost, and so talk a little bit about how this evolves from an abandoned vehicle to a missing persons case and ultimately into a double homicide.
So after the Inyo County Sheriff's Office called off the ground and air search, and it off and on, that process went on for, the better part of a month, because there was also a private search funded by Jules Berman. But after all of that died down and the Sheriff's Office was convinced it was foul play, they began pursuing different avenues of inquiry, but none of them were really backed by any evidence. It was just speculation. I mean, did they run off and just deliberately vanish as a way of just disappearing from Jules's mega wealth world entirely and just move to some remote location? Were they robbed and kidnapped? What happened to them? Was there some sort of cult involvement? Was this Punjabi guru somehow involved? Anyway, they quickly ruled out those kinds of things and started looking around and focusing on the people who were there in the same area when the Bermans disappeared. And there was only a small number of them. And one of the people who aroused investigators' interest was a man that they understood was a military man. They knew his name was Mike. He was traveling alone, and there was some behavior of his that seemed suggestive. And the investigators began to zero in, but they had no idea who he was or where they could find him.
Oh, wow. Yeah. And you talk about in the book, too, there were a very small handful of people who presumably were the last to see this couple alive. And so talk a little bit about like what we know for sure in terms of, or at least what they can safely presume in terms of what happened after they left the automobile. Like they arrived at nighttime, and then kind of from there, like sort of what they can kind of piece together.
Here's what investigators found, and then even decades later, I was able to go back, re-interview the key people, and follow the footsteps of the Bermans, both literally, kind of physically following in their paths, and also through interviews and investigation, looking at everything. It appears what happened, and this is what we know. They arrive on a Sunday evening. It's a moonless night. They park near one of these beautiful concrete and stone soaking pools. They get out. They actually put on bathing suits, which is rather unusual. The bathing suits might have come off later. They weren't prudish. They were just, cautious people. They slipped into the water. So imagine, it's wintertime, a little bit cold out, but you're in this wonderful, warm bath water, and there are three men in the tub with them, and they're all chatting. Two of the men are actually young guys. They're in their 20s, and they're dirt bike riders, motorcycle riders, and they're out there with an older buddy. He was kind of the one that put the trip together, and they're riding around on their dirt bikes during the day, and then at night they're drinking and hanging out in the hot tubs and just having a good time. Three motorcycle riders from Modesto. Then there's this man traveling alone, seems like a nice guy, has kind of a resonant voice. He's an officer in the military. He is well-spoken. He mentions that he'd gone to school in New Mexico, seems well-educated. At a certain point, the motorcycle riders get up to go to bed, and they leave this fellow Mike, the military man, in the tub with the Bermans for some indeterminate amount of time, and then everybody goes to bed. The next morning, the Bermans are reportedly seen by campers that we haven't been able to ever identify, but it was a couple in there and their son, hippie couple from Northern California is how they were described. They said they'd seen the Bermans head off up this rough little road that leaves from the campground and goes a long way into the desert wilderness and eventually crosses out of Saline Valley and down a very rugged canyon into Eureka Valley, another beautiful desert valley. So the Bermans go off hiking up the road. The motorcycle riders observe Mike, the military man. He takes stuff out of his truck. He's going to head out for the day in his vehicle. So he unloads his camping gear and such. He's got gas and water and a shovel. And he starts going up that same road in the same direction that the Bermans have gone. Eventually, the motorcycle riders also head off in that direction, but they're kind of exploring around. Sometimes they're riding into places where really they shouldn't. They're supposed to stay to the road, but these guys are out there having fun and driving up these dry washes and such. Well, what happens is late in the day, the military man in his little pickup truck is observed coming back down this road. And he's observed by a couple that had just arrived in camp a few hours earlier, an older guy and a younger, very pretty woman. I don't name them in the book because they asked me not to. I did interview them. They're well known in the Eastern Sierra as mountaineers and outdoors people. So he comes into camp, parks his truck. He walks over to where they're camped. He's dusty and covered in dirt, and he seems kind of jumpy. And he said, "Well, I quit smoking, but I'd really like a pack of cigarettes." And he saw that they had some cigarettes, and he offered to trade a can of peaches for a pack of smokes. So the woman, this younger woman, very pretty, says, "Oh, sure," and they chat a little bit. Well, the next thing you know, he's like raising the possibility of having a threesome. And he's just met these people. So he comes back to camp. The Bermans never come back, but he comes back. He's been gone all day. He's covered in dust. He's kind of jumpy and edgy, and he wants to have a smoke even though he's quit. And he's charged up and talking about having sex. That is suggestive of somebody who might have gone off the rails because of some sexual motivation, or maybe something happened that charged him up sexually. We're not sure what this guy is made of, but investigators thought this was very suggestive behavior, and they wanted to talk to him. Problem was, they didn't know where to find him.
Yeah, so you talk about just again a very small group of people. You talk about the fact that the dirt bike riders were very forthright. They cooperated, and even I believe you mentioned that you were able to re-interview some of them as well. So the spotlight seems to almost immediately focus on this former military gentleman, and so talk about they do eventually locate him. It sounds like, and initially he does cooperate and give them an interview. Talk about, what transpired at that point.
Yeah. Well, the motorcycle riders were just an open book, as you indicate. They were very forthcoming with investigators. Same thing when I interviewed them. They didn't try to be interviewed together and coordinate their stories. They actually sent me their original photos so I could look at them that they'd taken that day, kind of showing where they had gone. These guys are just an open book. I even looked at one of the motorcycles because I wanted to see, could you carry a passenger on it? Because based on where the Bermans' bodies were found, it's highly unlikely they could have hiked that far. They must have been in a motor vehicle of some kind. Well, one of the dirt bikes that is still under a tarp up on this fellow's property, I took a look at it, and as expected from the manufacturer specifications, there's no passenger seat, there's no foot pegs, it's just a little dirt bike. So they were eliminated as possible suspects. Now, the military man, some extraordinary work by this deputy, Leon Boyer. He was able to figure out the guy's name. He started going out to Saline Valley on his own time. He had a composite drawing that was a remarkable likeness of the man, as it later turns out. And eventually he's able to develop information of who he is. Turns out he's a captain at a Marine Corps logistics base. He actually is the adjunct to the commanding general. So the sheriff's office arranges to do a surprise interview of him. And they go to the base, they sit down in a conference room. The commanding general says, there's some people here who want to talk to you. So he walks in, he sits down, they click on the tape recorder. Now, he could have lawyered up, but he didn't. And when they start asking him questions, he seems kind of nervous, but, who wouldn't be in that situation? And, at the beginning, he seems to have good recall. He's offering a lot of detail. But then when they start getting into, where were you that day? Tell us about your trip. And keep in mind, this was before the bodies had been found. Only 10 months had gone by. And this military man, he couldn't remember whether he had gone on a trip alone or with somebody else. He couldn't remember where he camped. He seemed fuzzy about the dates. He didn't want to be pinned down about anything. Then when they finally get him to admit that he was there during the time frame, he had parked in the same place and camped at the same campground, they start trying to get some detail. Well, what did you do while you were there? Well, he's all over the board. They're asking him about the day in question. Oh, I might have gone for a drive. Oh, gosh, I think I went for a hike. Oh, I sat in the tub and read a book all day. He was offering up floating different explanations. And when the law enforcement guys would start to attack that and make him realize, oh my God, they know more than I think, he would veer off in another direction. It was a terrible interview. I mean, don't hold it against me. I'm a lawyer, so I can't help but think like a lawyer. And as a lawyer, I kept wanting to just tell him, stop talking. Right. Lawyer up, man. Don't keep talking because you're hanging yourself right now.
Yeah. So, I mean, based on that, the fact that obviously he was clearly digging himself some pretty substantial holes, even as someone who's never been in law enforcement, if I had been a party to that, immediately I'm thinking, I think we have our guy. So what are law enforcement thinking at this point? Do they think, hey, we've got our guy? And then obviously years go by where he's not arrested for this crime. It goes unsolved. So what happened that they were never able to quite put that case together?
Very much they did think they had their guy. And when I came into the case, John, I had a clean slate. I had no dog in this hunt. I would have loved to prove them wrong. But as I pieced together the evidence, interviewed people, and tried to determine what happened, I came to the same conclusion that the evidence seemed to point in his direction. Now, listen, he's never been arrested on this. He's never been charged. So under our system, he is innocent until proven guilty. However, the fact of the matter is that there's a lot of circumstantial evidence that points in his direction. Law enforcement felt they had the right guy, but they just didn't have the evidence. In fact, at first, they didn't even have the bodies. Then, almost 3 years after the Bermans disappeared, miles away, a hiker stumbles across a human skull. And when investigators go back to the scene, they find a grave site where it's obvious that somebody has deliberately concealed these bodies by removing their clothing, stacking them in a kind of a natural feature of what's called a desert dry wash, where water has carved a kind of a trough, and the bodies were stacked in there and then covered with rocks and dirt and concealed. And but they're, by the time they find the remains, the remains are so degraded they can't determine a cause of death. They're sure it's a homicide. It's classified as a homicide and a deliberate hiding of the bodies afterwards. But they don't know how it happened. The only piece of evidence that's rather chilling and suggestive is that they found a tiny handcuff key with the remains. But there was nothing to tie the remains to any specific cause of death, or for that matter, any person. And so, the whole investigation just kind of goes by the wayside. In fact, the Inyo County Sheriff's Office never even prepares a homicide report. They just kind of give up on the case. Later, a federal investigator gets involved because the chief suspect was a U.S. Marine, and also the homicides occurred on federal land. So the federal government had jurisdiction to investigate, and they did. And they came into it charging hard and trying to figure out what happened. They also had their eyes on the same suspect, but it just didn't pan out. It didn't pan out. They didn't get enough to file charges. So there the case sat until I started investigating.
Thank you for listening to From the Void. If you enjoyed this or any of the prior episodes, please consider rating, reviewing, and sharing with a friend. We'll be back next week with the second part of my interview with author Doug Kari. Until then, you've been listening to From the Void.